Now, over time, what happened is, you've got these churches making copies from the 2nd century onward, but all those copies didn't last until now. And in fact, the vast majority of those were disappeared and destroyed. And so, even though Alexandria, the Western Caesarean text type, and the Byzantine text type all had, at some point, countless thousands of copies, they eventually got destroyed to the point where most of the Byzantine early documents, or if not all of them, were lost, and the majority of the Western Caesarean documents have gone. And actually, at one point, for a large part of history, we didn't have anything from Alexandria. So they either got lost or were destroyed, or something like that. Now, around the 15th century, 14th, 15th century, what was happening up until that point, the Catholic Church was using the Latin Vulgate, and that's all they were using. And at a certain point, you had these scholars who started saying, why aren't we working out of the original Greek and Hebrew manuscripts? We should get together and work out of those. Now, you've got all these manuscripts out there, and none of them are alike. And the scholars at that time knew that, and so they said, well, if we're going to work out of the Greek and Hebrew, we need to figure out what the original words were. And that was the beginning of what we now call textual criticism. Textual criticism is the discipline of determining what the original words were. And so that really got started maybe before Erasmus, but Desiderius Erasmus was one of the first major and probably most famous of the early textual critics. So this guy Erasmus decides he's going to piece together what the original Greek and Hebrew was, because his copies were slightly different from one another. And so he's going to make one so that from now on, translators who are translating into English or whatever language can work right out of the Greek New Testament. So he gets together and he gets all the manuscripts he can find. Now, I got to warn you, it wasn't very much. In fact, here's what he had. He had one manuscript which had the Gospels in it, and that was from the 12th century AD. Now, keep in mind, he's doing this around 1500. I think his first edition was 1509 or something like that. So maybe just a couple hundred years old at the time that he was doing his work. He had another manuscript which had the epistles from the 12th century. He had about 2 or 3 other manuscripts which included both Gospels and epistles. And he had one manuscript which had the book of Revelation but was missing the last page, and that was from the 12th century. So as you can see, the majority of what Erasmus had to figure out what the original words were from the 12th century, and he didn't have but just a handful of manuscripts. And he didn't even have the complete Bible. He was missing the last page of Revelation. And kind of a funny story here is he was going to finish his Greek New Testament, so what he did is he made up the Greek words. He actually took the Latin Vulgate and he just guessed at what the Greek would have read. And that's the first edition of Erasmus' Greek New Testament. So anyway, that was kind of the beginning process. Now, just so you know, Erasmus' Greek New Testament was the foundation for the King James. So here I've got this line, and it's kind of representing the text that Erasmus and all the different scholars who were who influenced the King James. Those are all the documents, the manuscripts that they had when they made the King James. Now, I want to show you visually that they didn't have very many manuscripts, and they were not very old. In fact, they were mostly from the 12th century AD forward. So very, very young text, not very old. Now, compare that to modern translations. Now, since the King James, we have found, I think the count last time I read a count, it was 5,280. compare that to a dozen manuscripts. Today, when you got a modern translation, they take into account thousands and thousands of manuscripts. And we're not talking 12th century. We're talking 2nd century, 5th century, 6th century, from different parts of the world. So just astronomically more manuscripts, much older, much more reliable, and from different parts of the empire. So they're not just from one church. And so when a modern translation is performed, the scholars take a look at a lot more data and a lot more information than the King James translators had available to them. Unfortunately, what that means today is that the King James is slightly different than the modern versions. Now, all modern versions are essentially translated from the same Greek manuscripts. So what I'm trying to say is there's all modern translations are basically the same as far as what they omit and what they include. And the only one that's different is the King James. And that's just because of when they were translated and what was available to them at that time. So as you can see, we've got these translations that are different, and some verses are missing in one and included in the other. That is what we call textual variants. A textual variant is when there's a word that's missing in one manuscript, or it's misspelled in one manuscript and it's spelled a different way, or included in a different manuscript. And it can either be a single word, it could be a letter, it could be a verse, and sometimes it's an entire passage. So what I want to do is kind of give you an idea of how many textual variants there are, number one. I want you to get an idea of what most textual variants are like. And then I'm going to give you the ugliest of the textual variants there are. So the reason why I want to give you the ugliest of the textual variants is because I've heard stories of people that are witnessing to Jehovah's Witnesses or Mormons, and they'll go to cite a verse that's proving Jesus' divinity, and it's not original to John or whoever's writing, and so they find out the hard way from a Jehovah's Witness or a Mormon. And I think it's better to just be aware of these textual variants, that you can kind of begin thinking about how to respond to them when skeptics talk to you about it, or when you're witnessing, and just be prepared and knowledgeable about these. So anyway, that's my rationale behind all this.